No, Mr. Bond. I expect you to read. Here are some picks for Dr. No-Vember. Dr. No-Vember is an event dedicated to espionage literature written between 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, and 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. The event was created by Book Time with Elvis and is co-hosted with Randy Ray, the literate Texan, another bibliophile reads, and Steve Donoghue. As part of the event, they are reading a group read of John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And an awful lot of this fiction that's probably going to be talked about during this month will be the sort of the big three of John le Carré, Ian Fleming, and Len Deighton. Now, I've chosen to go a slightly different way on this because, well, I'm me and I can never do an event properly. Now, my book list for this event is my usual list of recommendations of books I've read or books that I want to read. I've ended up with a fairly big list of books because I wanted to do pretty much each decade of the Cold War, or the Cold War as we're imagining it from 1917 through 1991. But also there are books that were made into films, and I wanted to talk a little bit about them. And of course, I noticed that most of the books are written by men, and I wanted to include some espionage books about the Cold War written by women. And of course, although I've tried to avoid people like Ian Fleming and John le Carré and Len Deighton, I might have a Len Deighton non-fiction book right at the end. We start with John Buchan's book, The Huntingtower, from 1922. This is not one of John Buchan's Richard Hannay stories, which are rather more about the First World War and the threat of the Germans. This is a book about Dixon McCunn, who is a Scottish grocer from Glasgow, who likes his countryside pursuits and gets involved with a group of Russian emigres who are being threatened by some wicked Bolsheviks. The next book is Miss Brown of X.Y.O. by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Now, I really had to include an E. Phillips Oppenheim book in here because of his 1920 book, The Great Impersonation. That book is about the run-up to the First World War, but is notable because throughout the book we're never entirely sure exactly who the protagonist is. In this book, Miss Brown of X.Y.O., Miss Brown is a secretary who takes dictation from a dying agent and is pursued thereafter by a group of Bolshevik spies. The next book is So Disdained by Nevil Shute from 1928. Now, Nevil Shute is almost certainly better known for his post-Second World War books On the Beach and A Town Like Alice, but he was writing from the late 1920s onwards. In his first novels, he is a little bit of a fan of Mussolini, and often we see some guest appearances by black shirts helping the heroes out. In So Disdained, our hero, a pilot, teams up with another pilot who has been seduced into becoming a Russian spy and is rather regretting his choice and needs help to get out of this situation. Before the coming of our big three, Deighton, le Carré and Fleming, in the 50s and 60s, the leader of espionage fiction was arguably Eric Ambler. And the book I've chosen for Eric Ambler is his first successful novel, The Dark Frontier, from 1936. Now, Eric Ambler provides something of a contrast to Nevil Shute, because before the Second World War, Eric Ambler was a very avid fan of communism and of the Soviet Union. And in fact, a number of his novels have his hapless hero being helped out by a couple of Soviet agents, usually a man and his sister. And of course, the sister is very beautiful and very seductive. The Dark Frontier, which is Eric Ambler's first novel, was actually envisaged by Ambler as something of a spoof. It opens up with one of the main protagonists of the novel, a physicist, basically denouncing the content of the book because he says, I don't remember doing any of this. And then what proceeds is a rather daring-do adventure in the style of, well, maybe people like Bulldog Drummond. We move on to the 1949 book Atomsk by Carmichael Smith. This name might ring bells to people because you might have heard of the science fiction author called Cordwainer Smith, and it is the same person. Cordwainer Smith and Carmichael Smith were pseudonyms of the writer Paul K.A. Linebarger. Now, Atomsk is about a CIA agent who has to infiltrate a Russian city called Atomsk, which is their base for making their atom bomb. This is written in 1949, which is a year or so after the Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb, and everybody was extremely paranoid about how the Russians got all the intelligence to make the bomb. Now, although I definitely want to read this book, I'm a little bit worried about the description of this book that says the CIA agent spent quite a lot of his time sort of knocking about in Japan and Japanese occupied territory, pretending to be somebody from Japan. And this does feel a little bit like it might be a case of yellowface, and not very well applied yellowface. The next book is Night Train to Paris by Manning Coles from 1952. Adelaide Frances Oak Manning and Cyril Henry Coles were a husband and wife team who wrote spy fiction together. They started writing spy novels in the 1940s, featuring a character called Tommy Hambledon. And by the time we get to 1952, this is Tommy Hambledon's 16th adventure. And in this book, former teacher and spy Tommy Hambledon has to escort some secret documents on a train. The next book is Curtain of Fear from Dennis Wheatley from 1953. Dennis Wheatley was a prolific author, perhaps best known these days for his books about devil worship and adventures like that. But he also wrote a number of novels featuring different spies, whether it is Roger Brooke in Napoleonic times or Gregory Sallust during the Second World War. In this book, Curtain of Fear, Dennis Wheatley has an Anglo-Czech academic trying to escape Czechoslovakia while it is under Soviet control. We are still in Czechoslovakia for the next book, The Night of Wenceslas by Lionel Davidson from 1960. This is Lionel Davidson's first book and won the Golden Dagger, and is about a British man who is forced into spying for the Russians. William Haggard's book, The Slow Burner from 1965, has appeared in one of my lists before because he is distantly related to H. Rider Haggard. And Slow Burner is his first book that features his character Colonel Russell of the Security Executive, a sort of MI5 in disguise. Ian Fleming's James Bond encouraged an awful lot of spoofs, and I suspect that William Garner's book Overkill from 1966 is one of them. It features his hero Michael Jagger, a high-living, risk-loving, self-hating ex-agent. I'm looking forward to reading this book, possibly because the back page blurb contains a scene in which Michael Jagger has to fight off a naked woman. I think we can expect smut, which may or may not be a good thing for you. Our next book is Anthony Price, The Labyrinth Makers from 1970. This is the first in a long series of books about David Audley, who is a historian and academic, but also does a bit of analysis and spy work for a small section of British intelligence. Our next book is Gentleman Traitor by Alan Williams from 1974. Alan Williams is possibly better known for his books set in France and in French North Africa and also in the Middle East, which feature a character called Charles Pole. And Charles Pole does feature in The Gentleman Spy. Alan Williams worked as a journalist in North Africa and the Middle East, and in the late 1960s in Beirut he encountered Kim Philby shortly before Kim Philby disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. Kim Philby had left Britain under a cloud of suspicion earlier, but he hadn't been fully exposed as a spy, and his flight from Beirut was the confirmation that he was in fact part of the Cambridge spy ring. Philby, Burgess and Maclean are always the three that are named together, although there are others. Alan Williams' book The Gentleman Traitor deals with Kim Philby. The idea is that Kim Philby wants to get away from the Soviet Union. He is fed up with the place and is planning to come back. Only there are people in the British establishment who don't want him to come back, largely because he might expose their wrongdoings. And of course we don't know whether or not Kim Philby is acting honestly in this case or being yet again a traitor. We move on to Ted Allbeury's The 20th Day of January from 1980. I don't really like people imitating British people by having them go, what? But Ted Albury's Wikipedia page is definitely something that makes you go, what? 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 The Wikipedia page is very badly written, so we don't get an awful lot of detail. We just get some fragments, working behind the lines in Germany in the Second World War, operating across the Iron Curtain in the late 1940s, being captured by the KGB and tortured, possibly having his hands nailed to a table. And then there's a casual mention of his children getting kidnapped and not seeing them for decades. This man seems to have had a very rich life, and his friend Len Deighton is believed to have often asked him to write his memoirs because he seems a very, very fascinating person. I suspect that some of his life story is told in his novels, and certainly there are parallels to his personal life in the novels of his that I've read so far. In the 20th day of July, we have a British agent who discovers that the president-elect might actually be a Soviet agent. Now, I understand why many of you will feel that this is a completely ludicrous idea. I mean, there would never be a president of the United States of America who would be extremely pally with the Russians. That would never, ever, ever happen, would it? Now, the final book in this big list is Gerald Seymour's Archangel from 1982. And I wanted to include Gerald Seymour on this list because he's definitely a writer I want to get into reading. His most famous book is Harry's Game, which covers the troubles in Northern Ireland. And Gerald Seymour, who was a journalist for ITN, did quite a lot of work in Northern Ireland and in Vietnam and other flashpoints around the world. And his focus is often on sort of peripheral conflicts in the Cold War rather than the Cold War itself. But in Archangel, we have our hero who finds himself facing the Gulag for spying. Arguably, films and television have introduced many of us to great espionage books and authors, whether it is the film of John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, starring Richard Burton, or of course the James Bond films based on books by Ian Fleming, or the Harry Palmer films based on Len Deighton's nameless character from the Ipcress File and others. We start this list with the Berlin Memorandum, or the Quiller Memorandum, from 1965, written by Adam Hall. Adam Hall was the pseudonym of Trevor Dudley Smith, who later changed his name to Elliston Trevor. The book is about a fairly cynical British agent who is sent to Berlin to uncover a neo-Nazi ring who are attempting to subvert politics in West Germany. It was made into a film starring George Segal in 1966 with a screenplay by Harold Pinter. The film Hopscotch is a bit of a favourite of mine. I mean, I like Walter Matthau and Glenda Jackson, and they do have very good screen chemistry. That film from 1980 is a somewhat humorous version of Brian Garfield's book Hopscotch from 1975. In the book and film, a retired CIA agent is writing a book to expose the wrongdoings of his former colleagues. Now, the film has a fairly humorous tone while the book is a lot more serious. Brian Garfield was a former CIA agent, and he also wrote the book that became the film Death Wish. In Britain in the 1970s and into the 80s, the big three adventure thriller writers were arguably Alistair MacLean, Ham Dinnis and Desmond Bagley. Desmond Bagley, who I think is the best of the three, occasionally wrote spy fiction, and his 1970 book Running Blind is an excellent version of this. In this book, a former agent is sent to Iceland to act as courier for a mysterious device, which is probably a MacGuffin of some description. This book has quite a lot of interesting features of Iceland in it, and I have to say I had a map of Iceland open while I was reading the book. It was made into a short-run BBC television serial in 1979, starring Malcolm Studdard. The Eiger Sanction by Trevanian, published in 1972, introduces his character of Dr. Jonathan Hemlock. Dr. Jonathan Hemlock is an academic working in fine art. He also works as an assassin for a CIA-like agency. This was made into a 1975 film starring Clint Eastwood. Although you can see the elements of the humour that Trevanian definitely intended in his book, in the film, the presence of Clint Eastwood makes the film a little bit more po-faced and serious. We move on to the 1974 book 6 Days of the Condor by James Grady. James Grady worked on the staff of a US senator and later became involved as an investigative reporter for a muckraking journalist. 6 Days of the Condor was made into the movie 3 Days of the Condor, starring Robert Redford and directed by Sidney Pollack. Brian Freemantle's book Charlie M, or Charlie Muffin, from 1977, is the first in a long series of books about a rather world-weary British spy who has to put up with the vagaries and incompetencies of his lords and masters. It was made into a television series in 1979 starring David Hemmings. Gavin Lyle had written a lot of very well-received espionage books before he wrote The Secret Servant in 1980. The Secret Servant started life as an idea for a television pilot, but was developed into a series of 4 novels before it was actually eventually made into a television series starring Charles Dance in 1985. The books are very good, and the series was rather well done, although it's very difficult to find anywhere online. Our next section is women writing espionage. So far, almost all the books we have talked about have been written by men. Only Manning Coles had any input from women. This topic was brought up in a Dr. No-Vember live stream, and one or two of the participants seem to think that when it comes to espionage, it's not so much what do women write as what do women write? Now, women, of course, do write espionage literature, but they're not quite so well known as their male confreres. But 3 of these authors have had their books made into films. We start with Helen McInnes, who was a Scottish-American author who mostly wrote about World War II, but her book, The Venetian Affair from 1963, is very much in the Cold War. This was made into a film by Robert Vaughn, who you may know from the Man from U.N.C.L.E. series. Dorothy Gilman created the character of Mrs. Polyfax, who was a housewife turned spy, first featuring in The Unexpected Mrs. Polyfax from 1966, and this was a long series of novels. This was made into a film in 1970 starring Rosalind Russell, and also a TV movie in 1999 featuring Angela Lansbury. I suspect the Angela Lansbury TV movie was supposed to be a pilot for a future series, although it has to be said that the Rosalind Russell film is much more accurate to the book, and I think a better version of the books as a whole. I read and enjoyed the first book, and I'm not averse to reading the rest of the books in this series. Evelyn Anthony was a British author who is said to have been inspired by some of her father's work in the SOE in World War II. Her book, The Tamarind Seed, from 1971, is about a woman called Judith Farrow, who is a functionary at the British Home Office and on holiday in Barbados gets involved with a Soviet military attaché. And people back home want her to milk him for intelligence. This was turned into a film starring Julie Andrews and Omar Sharif. The next book is Climate for Conspiracy by Palmer Harcourt from 1974. There's very sketchy information about Palmer Harcourt, possibly because she appears to have worked in branches of British intelligence throughout her life, as well as writing some novels. Climate for Conspiracy, despite its name, does not appear to be about climate change and conspiracies concerning climate change. In fact, it's about a civil servant who gets appointed British ambassador to the newly created Republic of Canada and discovers that one of his associates might well be a Soviet agent. Our last female author is Sarah Gainham, who wrote the book Stone Roses in 1959. Sarah Gainham was a journalist who moved to Berlin after the Second World War and documented various aspects of the beginning of the Cold War. The Stone Roses is set once again in Prague in 1948, just after the communists have undertaken a coup and allowed the Soviet Union to take over. I have one last recommendation. It is something of a personal one, although it's not technically a spy book, and that is Len Deighton's action cookbook. Before he went into writing spy novels, Len Deighton was a food and cookery columnist for the Observer newspaper, and his columns were often accompanied by comic strips. Now, there is a slight family connection here, because when my parents were first married, they lived in a flat in a house about half a mile from where I am right now, and their downstairs neighbour was a certain Len Deighton, and my parents were always somewhat surprised by the sheer amount of milk and cream and eggs and butter that were being delivered to that house by the milkman every day. Michael Caine credited Len Deighton with introducing him to cookery and food when Michael Caine played Harry Palmer in the Ipcress File. And there is very much an idea that real men can cook in the book and the film of the Ipcress File. And this book is very much cooking for men. He wrote another book which concentrates on French cookery, which is sometimes called his French cookery course, but has the rather wonderful title of Uela garlic. So I hope you've had some fun with my recommendations, and I hope you'll read lots of espionage books for Dr. No-Vember.